Good afternoon and welcome to the Energy Markets Week. My name is Patrick Baudouin and I'm the organizer of this session. Before we start, a few housekeeping announcements. If you're watching this episode live on our Enlit Europe platform, you can interact with us via the chat box on the right side of your screen. Also, don't forget to hit the yellow register button on the right side next to this video so you can so your profile shows and it's easier to network and interact with the other attendees. So let us know that you're here, make use of the chat box and enjoy the discussion. Now over to the moderator of today's session, Jérôme Lepage. He's the Director for European Electricity Markets at EFET. Jérôme, the screen is yours.
Many thanks, Patrick, and indeed welcome everyone to this session of the Energy Markets Week for Enlit Europe. It's my pleasure today to moderate this panel on whether the current market design is fit for purpose now and in the coming years. Today we'll be having a discussion with Hélène Robet, the Head of Regulation and Market Design at ENGIE, Christian Baer, Secretary General at Europex, and Mathieu Franzen, Policy Officer at ACER, the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators. So before we get into the debates and in view of understanding a little bit where our three speakers and panelists come from, how they see the current market design and its ability to tackle future challenges, I'd like to give the floor to them for a few introductory statements, and then we'll start off the discussion. So I would hand the floor directly to Hélène for her introductory statement. Hélène, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Jérôme, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. To answer your question, Jérôme, I chose the picture you're now seeing on the screen. Basically, I think that while the target market design was relatively well defined in the third energy package with the famous network codes, so CSM, forward and balancing, now we see more and more ambitions and goals and instruments popping up. I can mention, for instance, the famous 70% constraint that is put on the available transmission capacity to be put at disposal of the markets as a new constraint. So these kind of additional interventions and measures, according to me, are now making the targets a bit more complex and a bit less clear. We can also mention, for instance, the lack of, for the moment, of clear EU guidelines on the procurement of flexibility services by the market or in the market by system operators, which makes the challenge of managing the network due to the increasing renewable energy sources generation very complex, and with a lot of decisions and implementations to be driven at national level, which means probably in an uncoordinated way with different instruments and different targets in the different countries. So in conclusion, and not to take too much time, I think that yes, the current market design could fit the energy transition if properly implemented. But with all the issues and difficulties and challenges we are seeing, first on the implementation phase, and second are related to the addition of new ambitions and measures, it makes it quite complex.
Thank you very much, Hélène, for those introductory words. Christian, would you say a few words about the topic we're about to discuss today?
Yes, thank you, Jérôme. I can just support Hélène in what she just said and maybe add a couple of additional aspects. So in addition to the 70% interconnection target by 2025, there's a political reality of 70% of renewable energy, renewable electricity by 2030. And this is, of course, a game changer. It's certainly an elephant in the room. This is now something we need to manage. We need to integrate into the market. We need to think about how to best integrate 70% of renewables into a target model that had been designed for a very different merit order, a very different energy mix initially. As marketplaces, we're convinced that the target model as such still holds up. It's also because it hasn't been fully implemented yet in all its aspects, that we haven't been able to see all the benefits and all the potential gains from it. So reaching 2030 means two things. First of all, to continue on the path of full implementation of the target model, further develop it eventually, maximize what is already in place. So the 2025 70% target and then maximization thereafter is certainly a very important aspect in this for the trading perspective of things. But then, of course, we need to continue building more grids. We need to upgrade grids. The whole backbone of the energy system needs to be upgraded, needs to be modernized, and we certainly need to speed up in terms of the actual grid network development. So if we don't do this, we will never reach neither 70% nor stronger electrification, nor the other climate targets. But this is very important. And then, of course, market integration will be the ultimate guarantor to deliver the energy transition at least cost. Because you could, of course, overinvest. You could certainly build more infrastructure than you need, but then this comes at an even higher cost. Not to mention that with renewables, you need to build, of course, much more capacity than in conventional energy sources, given that it's much more volatile, and you won't always have the wind and the sun to blow and to shine when you need it. And therefore, it's very important to get both right. So the backbone, the grid, and then, of course, also the market, liquid markets, transparent markets, efficient markets, to make sure that we exchange the energy we need in the most efficient manner and at the, most efficient price, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Matthew, up to you to give us your feeling from a regulatory perspective.
Thank you, Jerome. Thank you, Inlet, for having us here today in this panel. Really interested. So indeed, the main question, whether the market design is fit for purpose. I think what is important to say is that for us the main objective is that we implement and continuously strengthen and update the internal electricity target model. Because we consider that indeed this target model is there to have a functioning market, but also a key enabler into achieving the decarbonization objectives in an affordable way for EU consumers in the industry. And for that, in that respect, it is important to note all the ongoing developments to achieve this target model, which indeed also on our side we hope to have long been there. I think 2014 was a target, and 2020 was a target, and now 2025 is a target. But still working on it, but still I think every time we see further improvement. So indeed the integration of day-ahead and intraday markets, the ones we initially set out to do, almost complete, I would say, but indeed then further improvements coming, which indeed are also on the way, like the intraday auctions, flow-based capacity calculation, 50-minute trading as important aspects. Further integration of and harmonization of balancing markets, balancing energy, balancing capacity, balancing energy being done through the European platforms currently being implemented, balancing capacity still on a voluntary basis, but also there much development ongoing to get more market-based procurement in, and harmonization of imbalance settlement. So how markets and our market participants are being kept to their promises, kept to their trades, basically, when indeed the time to deliver comes. Improve the level of available cross-zone capacity. I think we'll discuss it more. Indeed, the infamous 70% requirements, the deadline by 2025. Already, recently the second report, I think, or shortly coming, the second report on the 70% reporting, the action plans on member states in order to achieve this. All important steps into further integrating the European electricity market. And then, I think a topic which also divides us a bit, the redefinition of bidding zones to better align the markets with physics. I think in the end, aligning markets with physics is a very important part of a functioning market design. We see indeed congestions increasing. We see that renewables also will have a tendency to create that even further, but they also need a solid price signal. And a solid price signal in bidding zones, but also between bidding zones. So this first EU bidding zone review is, in our view, a very important aspect to achieve that. And then finally, the development of a robust and sound resource adequacy assessment on a European level to really identify where the resource gap is in Europe, and indeed how we can work and have a functioning system and a functioning market delivering the resources and delivering the adequacy across Europe. Some important thing to say on what we do looking forward. So Acer is currently engaged in working on assessing or an improvement in our monitoring to assess barriers on efficient price formation and barriers to new entrants and innovative solutions. This is a new challenging task. It will be part of our market monitoring report, and it will allow Acer to challenge national obstacles, and we need to also promote best practices across Europe. So is the current market design fit for purpose? I would say it is not yet fit for purpose because we haven't implemented it. But we do consider that if it is implemented, it will be largely fit for purpose to achieve all the decarbonization goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mathieu, and indeed, Hélène and Christian as well for your comments. So first, let me remind to the audience that that at any time they can post questions through the chat, and we'll try to address them while we're going through this discussion. So very happy to take your questions or comments and try to respond or react to them. When I heard your statements, I was quite happy. Like we have common directions, also things that some of you stress more or less. But somehow I'd like to step back a little bit because we talked a lot about the target model, the fact that it was developed quite some time ago. We started in the late 90s. The current market target model probably dates back to the late 2000s in its current form. And we had quite a different environment back then. Fewer penetration of renewable energy, like technologies that were quite different. And in the meantime, things have improved or evolved quite a bit, both from a hardware and a software perspective. So I was wondering from your perspective whether how the general trilemma between security of supply, sustainability, and affordability of energy supply has changed, and how it has, whether it has moved targets, and how the new technologies, new services have potentially moved that environment so that the target model would not necessarily be fit for purpose still. So happy for any of you to start responding to that. Hélène, would you like to start again, or?
I'm happy to do so with some ideas. Well, I think that maybe what was not anticipated enough are the issues around adequacy and around congestions and other grid services to be performed. And I think that's where there would be need to potentially develop more about a model for making sure that markets can answer those challenges is typically in those two areas. So making sure that the necessary services for grid management, so be it congestion, but also reactive power or other technological services, if I can call it like this, can be procured from the markets, making sure that investments that are made can be valorized in everywhere where they can be valorized to avoid overinvestment.
Thank you, Hélène. Christian, on the same vein, how have also marketplaces potentially helped in the framework of that changing or not changing trilemma, and how does your technologies enable this move towards the energy transition?
So things have moved on very significantly. When you look back at 1996, the first electricity directive, and then in the early 2000s, certainly the third package as an important milestone. Back in the days, when modeling the target model, we also thought that the system would change with the model accordingly, and nobody has really built in the buffer needed for a reluctant system, as it always is the case, especially for such a complex environment we're in. Some have certainly been leading a bit more than others. Energy exchanges and markets have been leading from the very beginning, already in the 90s, but then really kicking up in the early 2000s. Many exchanges have been created ever since. We've developed a very significant and a very sophisticated package of different opportunities for the market to take up. So in terms of all time frames, derivatives markets, forward markets, what has happened in day-ahead intraday, especially with market coupling over the past few years, that's an amazing success story when you look at it, also internationally. And then now moving onto a more market procured balancing, that's also a very positive development, although it comes quite late. Could have probably kickstart a bit earlier. But again, the system is complex, it's difficult to change. Some actors are a bit less keen on immediately implementing all changes necessary. So we have to think in terms of the actual system once we create another target model. And this will be a moving target. Even if you keep on creating new target models, it may just not be the path you've defined in the model that will ultimately be implemented.
Thank you, Christian. Quite interesting. Maybe turning to Mathieu, regulators are usually the guarantors of that equilibrium between that balance between sustainability, affordability, and security of supply. And I mean, we're seeing a lot of focus on sustainability in the political sphere. How do you manage still that, like, to keep that balance and to understand the importance of all three pillars in order to make this target model still relevant?
Yeah, it's interesting. Of course, the whole trilemma balance is, of course, always a bit strange to a regulator. The renewable policy is indeed a much more governmental policy, and the primary focus has always been on efficiency, on creating efficient markets, creating efficient market functioning, and indeed only recently also Acer was given more tasks in monitoring security of supply. So expanding there. But if I look back and indeed being in the topic of market design for quite some years, I think the general thinking was always we should have a market that develops, works for any system, for whether it's renewable or the former coal and gas plants. This development, this dynamic development of moving into different generation types and allowing those generation types also to deliver security supply in the end is of course very important, and that's also always been underlying all the market design efforts. So it is not we design the market and we don't care about adequacy. No, the market is also there to deliver this adequacy. Indeed, the European tasks on assessing adequacy have come on top of that because, sort of historically, this was a pure national task, but it was already clear that some member states were depending on other member states, but never calculated whether they would depend on the same generation at the same time. So when moving into a European model, also European adequacy assessment is an important part of that. But maybe in the end, and starting indeed, and I agree with Christian, integration of balancing market has taken us a while. We started at the end. We started at the long term. We worked towards the balancing. We're now sort of at the final delivery. But I think it's also important to look back the other way. So real-time balancing is the actual electricity market. It is actual when electricity is provided, not now as we speak, literally, and it needs a price. And not delivering, so not being there now, of course, needs a long preparation in terms of investment decisions in dispatch, in planning, everything going up to that. And so the whole market design is a very long thread of steps influencing each other. And I think that the current design gives us a good starting point to have a market also develop or deliver on adequacy and on security supply. But it's of course always under challenge. It's always under pressure of member states thinking that they need to intervene and can't let the investment come from market participants. I think we maybe interesting before I close. I think had an interesting situation last week. We had the solar eclipse, which was interesting because it was TSO saying we need to do a lot of things. I think this morning there was a tweet from somebody from Tenet saying, I won a bet because we actually didn't need to do anything. The market solved this all by itself. And indeed, it's such a thing which you can expect. So market can perfectly solve it. Then I read about that. We talk about the wind eclipse. That is much more difficult. This is today coming tomorrow. But we still need the markets to do this. So I think markets can deliver adequacy, but we're not there yet, and we're definitely not there in a harmonized setting across Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mathieu. And saying that markets can deliver is only to my ears, of course, as a representative of energy traders. But I'm not here to comment so extensively on what you said. I mean, I hear what generally I hear okay, we have a target model that was built quite some time ago, but generally goes in the right direction, and allowing the market to face the challenges of any type of environment is really what this target model was meant for. But then many of you started giving examples where, okay, we're not there yet. So we heard about capacity management procurement. We heard about the balancing market. We heard about capacity adequacy. So I'm wondering, so is it that we don't have the tools, or we have the tools and we don't use them? Why are we in that position where the stuff that we decided 10 years ago is not there yet to help us. Any views on this? Is it lack of political will? Is it like just general slowness of things, or it's also fundamental issues implementing a target model that may not completely fit the modern world? Christian, Hélène?
Hélène, you want to go first, or?
Yeah, please go.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a very theoretical debate, of course. This is a moving target. Conditions keep changing all the time. At the moment, we're discussing CBAM, for example. This may have quite an impact on flows, especially in the near neighborhood. Impact on Greece, Christy from Turkey, Spain from Morocco, the Baltics, Finland from Belarus, and Russia. Then, of course, there's a lot of development in terms of climate ambition. 10 years ago, nobody thought about defining a 2050 net zero target, and certainly not a 2030 55/70% target for the electricity sector. So when this was imagined, we thought that it's more or less business as usual. We need to change bits and pieces here. We had 2020, of course, in place, so there was some direction. But this has now really changed in terms of overall ambition. And then you have a lot of actors. It's a very complex system. We have new technologies. We certainly have much cheaper renewables. Also, that wasn't really anticipated to the extent as is now the case. How cheap solar and wind have become, with all the consequences, of course, for the merit order and generally for the market. So it's not only to blame on the slowness of actors to implement, nor of regulators to push for the full implementation, also with limited means. Honestly, I think also the institutional and the governance framework could have been different earlier on. So that ACER was only created 10 years ago was way too late. They should probably have included this already in 1996 to have more coordination. It was called a predecessor, but without any teeth. And I would even argue that now ACER doesn't have the necessary teeth to really implement everything according to plan. There's still too much coordination needed between different member states. We had Lisbon only kicking in 2009 with, well, Article 194 of the TFEU defining energy as a common competence. So this also came very late in the EU institutional framework. Used to be a very national domain. It is still largely a very national domain. So if you look at all these different anchor points, it's very difficult to just blame it on slow implementation. But it's quite a moving environment overall. And I think we now start to really have the necessary instruments. I mean, look at the debate now around 2025 and the 70% target. The latest ACER report, where they've been really critical about member states. This wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago, I imagine. But now ACER really takes on other regulators, different actors in the system. They tell them what to improve, how to improve. So we're making good progress. And maybe to put this into perspective internationally, the EU is by far the most integrated, the biggest, the most efficient energy system on the whole planet. So it's also, to a certain extent, the luxury debate we're having here. We're already really advanced and a very good system in place. There's fine-tuning needed, and very significant improvements up to 2030 and even more up to 2050 and beyond. But we already have quite a integrated and a well-working system in Europe.
Thanks, including for this ray of hope and yeah. So like we can also congratulate ourselves in Europe a bit for everything we have achieved, but yeah, there's still a way to go. So Hélène, what's your take on the tools we have and why we can't really use them?
I think that the spirit of the third energy package, so the laid down in the network code, was very ambitious. And to me, the spirit of the text was quite clear in terms of what we wanted to achieve. But since a lot of details and operational decisions, technical decisions were left for the implementation phase, and you know, devil is always in the detail, and if things are not put black on white on paper in the guideline and so in the network code itself, it then opens the door to interpretation, to escape doors that are used maybe not the way they were supposed to be. I can just illustrate that with one example. It's the imbalance settlement price that Mathieu was mentioning. To me, the spirit of the balancing guideline is extremely clear, and so goes for the remuneration of balancing energy. When I read marginal pricing, to me, it doesn't give much room for interpretation. But as I said, devils being in the detail, we saw that while implementing, so creating the technical methodology that was supposed to describe in practice how to implement this cornerstone, for me, this fundamental principle of electricity markets, we ended up with a methodology that is not a bit more than an empty box, if I can be direct, but which is not very clear and which gives so much room for each member state to implement a different way to price the energy in real time. And as we mentioned before, this is really key, because everything we do before that is an anticipation, is due to what will happen in real time. So not having a good, and you can of course debate what is good and what is not good, but not having a good pricing of energy in real time, for me, is quite problematic. So this was my point for the details that were left in the implementation phase, that for me slowed down a lot the implementation process of network codes. The second point for me is maybe the fact that some key prerequisites were not ready yet. For instance, and okay, I'm not a specialist, but we hear a lot that TSOs are facing huge difficulties around the common grid model. So for those who are not familiar, and with my humility of market party, I understand that there's a kind of common cartography of the network, allowing TSOs to talk to each other in real time and allowing them to cooperate efficiently in order to operate the grid safely. And we hear that this tool is missing or is not yet ready, although necessary. So that could explain also why things are going slower than expected. And last but not least, I would mention the incentives as well to system operators. Example for the procurement of flexibility services to the markets, where maybe the remuneration of TSOs and the way grid tariffs are spread over the grid participants and organized in the different countries may not fit those new needs that we will need in the future. So those are, for me, three potential explanations for the slow implementation.
Thanks, Hélène. Good overview. Mathieu, what can we do about it? What can you do about that?
It's a good question. Good question. Yeah, thank you. Indeed, I also, maybe reflecting a bit on what Christian and Hélène said. I think I would say I would completely agree with you that indeed the spirit of the third package was quite that. Well, there should be centralization. We should really implement. But indeed, in the end, we ended up with a network code, and then actually the network code putting this at lower level. Then a debate for almost roughly 10 years about who should take the decisions on that. In the end, only recently leading to European decisions being taken directly by Acer in the clean energy package. I think, and maybe this is what I would say on this speed of implementation. I think the speed of implementation, it definitely was burdened by the lack of a good governance framework of this design. So my assumption in the past was never that NRA should first take a year to think about this before they referred it, but this is what in the end happened. So having direct decisions by ACER on European methodologies, having this made directly, I think could have sped things up in the past. I think we're now there. But maybe also to talk about the other side of things. I assume you all know ACER was consulting until last week on CACM 2.0 proposals, and also there we make a proposal to go for a better governance framework. Having NEMOs also vote on a qualified majority level, making sure that they are able to solve the disagreements between them and take a common responsibility and decide on way forward. Of course, taking into account all the consultation and the input from stakeholders in that, instead of just sort of sitting on the status quo because there's no way to agree unanimously on any way forward. So those kind of things. So the governance, my general statement, the governance framework of a market design like the European one, the speed really depends on how quick you can make decisions, even if you don't agree. How you can take a majority decisions on moving forward is indeed really important. Maybe to reflect a bit, and I think Helene knows I'm the last one to be happy with the pricing decision. I agree with her that could have been better, but indeed more sort of a legal problem in the end, although being very small textual thing, but being a legal problem in the end to really make the step to real harmonization. And in the end, we lack full. I do see sometimes a step forward and maybe a step back. So having the platforms will show us how they work and will also give us the subsequent possibility to further improve it. On balancing, I've been working on it. I recently counted, it's my 11th or my 10th year working on balancing. And we're still not having the platforms we said we should have within 6 years when we started 10 years ago. So let's have them first and then further improve, because sometimes also that is a better way forward.
Thank you, Mathieu. I'm going to get back directly to you because we're discussing imbalance settlements, balancing energy pricing, and you mentioned in your initial statement that this work that you're doing on price formation for markets
barriers,
it's really key. It starts with imbalance settlements. So could you elaborate a little bit on how you can improve the whole setting with this kind of reporting and the actions that you would be keen to take on as part of this project?
Yeah. So what we've engaged in, and to be honest, I'm talking as an internal outsider, so to say, but indeed engaged into a way of comparing market designs on a national level, comparing how markets function, how specific design aspects of markets allow entry of small market participants, allow efficient price formation, in order to compare them between each other and also show sort of the good examples from the bad, basically, and allow indeed the comparison between countries on a national level. So not only the European methodologies, but also how is procurement done nationally. I think balancing is an important part of that. How is imbalance settlement done? What are the exact design aspects of those national markets? Indeed, also allowing to say, okay, this is where we are. This is the harmonization step those countries already need to take, and how are they complying with them? Because indeed, you do see, and I agree with Helene on that, you do see that what we intended to decide and go towards, and then the practice, well, not always the same, I would say. And indeed, national debates sometimes have a very big gap towards what Europe thought it would be. So those reports, this study really allows us to do this comparison on a detailed level, but at the same time making a composite aggregated indicator out of that, and then comparing countries, which you can then subsequently zoom into on what is creating indeed this barrier, or what is creating that price formation isn't efficient.
Thank you very much, Mathieu, for this. So you mentioned new entrants, and that brings me to the question of, it's just not all technologies that enter a new market, but also new technologies, new services, and we've started talking more and more about demand response. We're seeing electricity storage kind of gradually get cheaper. There's of course a whole debate about energy system integration and energy conversion in general. So I was wondering what your views were on how the existing market design is able to facilitate the entry of those new technologies and services, and foster their development in the context of the energy transition. So maybe Hélène, then Christian, also on how market management and marketplaces technologies can improve that. Hélène, you want to start?
Well, I think that the importance again is to make sure that all, as much as possible, what is needed by TSOs and DSOs to operate the grid safely is procured in the markets via transparent and public tendering, allowing all technologies and all willing market participants to participate. And to make sure that also on the balancing and the balancing markets, that the needed capacities are procured on a market-based way. So, for instance, we very much welcome the fact that France will switch the secondary reserve to a market-based process as from October or November, if I'm not mistaken. So currently, it's an obligation to producers, and it will be replaced by a procurement in the market. So typically, making sure that all needed services are procured in the market in a transparent and market-based way with correct pricing mechanism as well. It's important to attract investments, making sure that there is transparency on the needs of the grid. We know that, for instance, redispatching and other congestion services are often creating fears from TSOs, DSOs, or NRAs about potential abuse of dominant position. We think that by putting the light on the needs and on the tenders and on the result of the tender, of course, in an anonymous basis, but making sure that there is information available in the markets on what is needed will attract investors where there is a need to develop things, and will allow all market participants and all technologies to participate. And I think in terms of development, we can mention the development of the SIDC platform, so the continuous intraday trading platform, which is a super great tool for allowing intermittent producers to hedge their position in the markets, benefiting from the liquidity from across the border. So especially for those located in small bidding zones in the intraday market, it's really great to benefit from liquidity from other bidding zones. So we think that development on the intraday should continue, and making sure that liquidity is pulled together, and that the trading in the intraday market is ensured at all times is key.
Thank you, Hélène. Christian, any views on this?
Yeah, intraday is certainly a very important tool for this. But so are the other market segments too. In terms of hedging, in terms of energy system integration, it will be very important to have an efficient long-term market too. It's a technical issue ultimately. When you look at an almost only renewable system, it will be impossible to store energy other than through electricity to gas, power to gas. So the storage options, the storage technologies directly for electricity are very limited. Even if you were to look at very big batteries in whatever sort of circumstance, high pressure batteries, whatever sort of technology you look at, it's just not the same as the massive volumes of gas we can store, we can cheaply ship, and we can very easily retransform into electricity or directly use for appliances. You always need to take into account, of course, the energy losses when doing system integration and generally energy transformation. So this will be a big discussion about technologies. In terms of hydrogen, we're still not there. In terms of renewable gases in general, there's still a lot of technological problems to solve. So one is storability of hydrogen, for example, or transportability of hydrogen. Liquefied hydrogen requires minus 235 degrees Celsius, for example, and we just don't have that technology yet at large industrial scale. Not to mention the cost and the energy input you need for that sort of endeavor. When you look at other technologies, there are quite some caveats around there as well. Biomethane, ammoniac, whatever sort of technology you look at, there's always drawbacks. It's just not perfect. Nothing is perfect yet, but a lot of innovation is happening. A lot of developments are on the way. So something to follow. And I think that with this big kickoff now of a clear 2050 net zero target, we'll certainly see very important technological changes in the years to come. For that to happen now, it's very important to have a level playing field among the different carriers to the extent possible. Of course, you cannot compare apple and oranges, but in terms of taxation, for example, in terms of the actual levies, feed-in tariffs, grid tariffs, etc., you should more or less have an equal level playing field to really ensure that the cheapest and most affordable solution finds its way to the market, and then ultimately the market will decide what the most affordable and the most cost-efficient way is to integrate the system.
Thanks, Christian. So I'm playing the ball back to Mathieu, maybe with an extra question. So, yeah, is the market design fit for all those new technologies and services? And we're hearing about potential new network codes for demand side flexibility. So what does it mean, and why would we need special rules tailored for some parts of the market? So let's see what's your view on this.
Yeah, maybe it's good to mention. So I think in general we see also here, we see that the current market design, well, although maybe designed around supply, it wasn't designed around specific supply. Although being designed to supply demand, it was also not about specific demand. So there's nothing in the legislation saying only this kind of demand or that kind of demand should participate. So in the end, whatever development it should be able to be covered by the existing market design. What you could say is that the thinking about the level at which this demand and generation is available and need the distribution of it, the size of it. So that's probably where we say, well, we might need additional things. So if we look at, I think RFGs and interesting, the RFGs are requirements for generators, requirements on production. Actually, solar panels more than 800 watts, not kilowatts, more than 800 watts were already considered in EU legislation. So technical, it's there, but indeed in terms of markets, in terms of access, well, DSOs were considered as never having problems, and this was always possible. So lowering the layer at which you look, lowering the layer at which you maybe harmonize or create European rules, that is probably something that needs to be assessed. Does that lead to a new network code or changes to existing? I think that debate is still open. I think a lot of well, the system and how it is looked at European level also expands. The scope is also expanded to DSOs, but whether they need something specifically from a European level, I think that is exactly what needs to be seen. So I think that this is also the process. Well, tomorrow, I think today, we have a slide in the Florence Forum about our process in that. We'll look into the topic. We'll discuss the topic, the content. We, of course, will assess it against consistency of other legislation. And then in the end, it's up to the Commission to say, okay, we add an article, a chapter, or whatever to existing legislation, or we create something new completely. In the end, that's probably more lawmaking than a content debate. So I think that will be it. Yeah, no, I think that was it. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mathieu. Maybe for the last few minutes that we have, like to go down one level again still, as Mathieu, you pointed out. We saw the birth or the launch of the EU DSO entity last week, to which of course we're sending our congratulations. And the idea there is indeed to start digging deeper. The current market framework is mainly targets TSOs indeed. And the link between the market and the TSOs. So that may be a blind spot that we still have. And I'm wondering how you perceive the possibility for greater DSO involvement, either in market rules or clarification of congestion management processes, as Hélène mentioned at one point. So what's your perspective on that and the future role of DSOs in this market, and whether indeed we need more detailed market design rules for them and for their interaction with the markets?
Yeah, it's interesting debate. Maybe now I'm more talking about as an electrical engineer than I would as an economist, because the discussion of DSOs on congestion in their grid is much different one than the TSOs have when talking about congestion in their grid. Congestion of DSOs is mainly congestion on how to get the cables in the ground and expand the network, because people want a connection and they feel they can't supply it. And then of course subsequently they want to have the market-based tools to approach this. But the question is whether somebody wanting a connection on this distribution grid actually wants to provide those services or just wants to access the market, basically. And I think that's probably a challenging. Also, DSOs usually don't have that much room for contingencies and for outages. So if you overload their networks, it just turns off, which of course is not what you want as a consumer. So these are all challenging things. Access to the market is probably usually much more about access to the grid, having a connection, being able to use it at equal rules and rights. And then the question comes up of whether you need to organize a market for those services. Probably to a certain extent you be able to use it. But I think still, but that may be more a personal opinion, I still think that the grid expansion is probably much more needed, and a much more bigger focus is needed on that than procuring services to prevent those investments. Because if we look at the developments in the future, probably we need much more in solid copper in the ground or aluminum in the ground.
Thanks, Mathieu. Christian, any view on this and how we can facilitate market services at distributed level?
Yeah, I think one very important factor will be flexibility markets. So this can be demand side response driven, obviously. We currently already see a couple of pilots around Europe. They're going quite well. It's very important to get these together and to optimize the flows already at local level. I perfectly agree with Mathieu that for the DSOs, the next 20, 30 years will all be about grid expansion, making sure that all these electrical cars won't lead to an explosion somewhere. So this is their main focus. It's certainly good that we now have an EU DSO entity and to have one interface to talk to, although it's still only an entity and not really all DSOs speaking with the same voice and not necessarily meaning the same things with the same words. But there's some culture to be developed. I mean, we've seen how long it has taken SOE to sort of develop some common terminology and vocabulary. But yeah, it's certainly a good step forward. Generally, the DSOs are a bit behind. I mean, in terms of what's available in flow information and what's actually happening in those DSO grids. We're certainly 20 years behind. But there's quite some work ahead, some room for improvement. But yeah, in the meantime, what's really important at local level is those local flexibility markets, and that's already being developed, and certainly a very important feature and instrument for the future.
Many thanks, Christian. That may be a last few, the last word for Hélène. As a market participant, what will you expect and what not also from DSOs and their involvement in market questions?
Well, I would like very much to expect transparency and openness for allowing out-of-the-box thinking and making sure that even though, as Mathieu and Christian just said, the development in the network will be huge and massive, I think there is still a lot of room for development of services. I mentioned reactive power is one of them. We see some pilots in some projects, but we would like to see this in all countries. And I think indeed some openness for taking profit from good experiences that are developed in some countries to be not copy-pasted, of course, because there are some specificities, but to inspire other experiences. And as well, I think reflections and development around the remuneration and the incentives for system operation will be needed. I hope we can expect that.
Thank you, Hélène, and thank you, Mathieu and Christian as well for this very interesting discussion. This leaves us all on an optimistic note. I think market design can work. The current one, we may need to implement it harder, tailor it to new things that are approaching the system these days. But it looks like we're on good track. So let's continue on that, I would say. But that being said, it's almost 3 o'clock. I will hand back the floor to Patrick, and I would like to thank you all for your participation, and indeed to the audience as well for their questions.
Thank you, Jerome, and thanks to all the panelists. Tomorrow, at the same time, a new energy market session will be broadcasted on this platform. So have a look at the agenda, and also don't forget to hit the yellow register button, because otherwise your profile will not show. Keep using the platform to network after this session ends also, and hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you, everybody.